It is one of the darkest jokes in economic history. Tragedy may kill millions, but it almost never kills opportunity. The Black Death was no exception. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague tore through Europe and North Africa with a violence humanity had never seen. Towns were wiped off the map, families erased from memory, and half of Europe's population simply disappeared. But beneath this unimaginable loss, something else was happening quietly, almost invisibly. Wealth was being redistributed on a scale that makes modern recessions look trivial. Old elites were collapsing, new fortunes were taking shape, and some of the most influential dynasties in European history were being born from the ashes of catastrophe. It sounds almost obscene to say it, that in the middle of a pandemic that killed tens of millions, certain families walked away richer than ever. But this is the uncomfortable pattern of economic history. When a system breaks, someone always picks up the pieces. And the Black Death didn't just break systems, it shattered them. The plague didn't just kill peasants, merchants, and craftsmen. It killed heirs. It cleared landowners. It wiped out banking competitors. It toppled noble lines that had ruled for centuries. And when old wealth loses its owners, new owners step forward. Not because they are villains, but because the incentives of a broken world make ambition irresistible. Welcome to Paper Empire's history. Today we tell the story of how the greatest crisis in history turned into the greatest opportunity. To understand who got rich, you have to picture Europe at its moment of maximum vulnerability. Ships arriving at Genoa carrying dead sailors. Monks writing that no bells rang because there was no one left to ring them. Documentaries usually stop at this horror, but our story begins here, because the economic impact wasn't temporary. It was structural. Labor shortages destroyed the foundations of feudalism. Abandoned lands created a property vacuum, and through each of these cracks, new winners emerged. And nowhere is this clearer than in Florence. In the late 14th century, as the plague receded and returned in waves, Florence emerged as a city of survivors. Competitors died off, trade networks collapsed, and banking houses struggled to remain solvent. And into this vacuum stepped a man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. Not a noble, not a titan, just a very shrewd banker with impeccable timing. Giovanni founded the Medici Bank in 1397, right after the second major plague. Wave had destabilized Florence's financial sector. Many of the city's traditional banking families had lost heirs, partners, or their entire operations. The once dominant Bardi and Peruzzi dynasties were shadows of their former selves. Giovanni filled the gap. The Medici Bank gained lucrative contracts, such as becoming the papacy's financial manager, an opportunity that likely wouldn't have been available had the plague not wiped out rivals. It wasn't just banking. Demographic collapse meant fewer nobles and merchants competing for political influence. The Medici stepped into positions of economic and civic leadership almost by default. Without the plague, the Medici might have remained a successful Florentine family. Instead, they became the family that bankrolled Renaissance art, produced popes, and set the stage for modern finance. You could argue quietly and carefully that Michelangelo owes part of his career to the Black Death. But Florence wasn't unique. Milan experienced an even more dramatic transformation. The ruling Visconti family didn't just survive the plague. They weaponized the power vacuum it created. In a pandemic with a 60% fatality rate, when noble families died without heirs, their lands reverted to higher nobles or were seized by opportunistic rivals. The Visconti were masters of this game. Bernabo Visconti aggressively expanded Milan's territory by absorbing the estates of families extinguished by the plague. His successor, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, used strategic marriages and the demographic chaos of the era to consolidate enough land and power to be crowned the first Duke of Milan in 1395. In another era, that kind of expansion might have taken centuries of warfare. In the wake of the Black Death, it took a generation. When the aristocracy is collapsing all around you, becoming next in line to multiple estates is less a matter of luck and more a matter of mathematical probability. If there were a gold medal for benefiting from inheritance collapses, the Visconti would be strong contenders. Across the Channel, England saw the rise of an entirely new class, the gentry, families who weren't noble but suddenly controlled enough land and wealth to become political players. And unlike the Medici or Visconti, these names aren't always famous today, which makes their stories even more striking. Take the Paston family, for instance. They began as modest landowners in Norfolk, but when neighboring estates lost heirs during plague outbreaks, the Pastons bought land at astonishing discounts or acquired it through legal claims. Their sudden wealth gave them access to education, courts, and royal patronage. They became power brokers for generations, their rise is documented in the famous Paston Letters, which paint a vivid picture of social mobility born from demographic collapse. They weren't alone. The Della Pole family rose rapidly through trade wealth and acquiring lands abandoned or sold cheaply after the plague. The Neville family, who would later become central figures in the Wars of the Roses, expanded their wealth during plague-induced vacancies in the northern aristocracy. The economic aftershocks of the Black Death didn't end in Florence, Milan, or England. The deeper you push into the wreckage of 14th century Europe, the clearer a pattern emerges. Wherever death created a vacuum, someone stepped in. To see this more clearly, you have to turn north, to the icy ports of the Baltic, where the Hanseatic League transformed the crisis into an opportunity. The Hanseatic League wasn't a nation. It was a network, a cartel of merchant cities, stretching from Lübeck to Riga. And during the plague, demand across Europe became chaotic. Grain harvests fell. Maritime trade suffered. Prices for essential goods skyrocketed. The merchants of the Hanseatic ports stepped into this disruption with the cold precision of traders who understood that scarcity is the mother of profit. Families like the Weckenhuysens in Danzig and the Goslins in Lübeck expanded their fleets while others were going bankrupt. They bought cheap grain from untouched regions in the east and sold it at enormous markups in plague-stricken cities in the west. They secured monopolies on timber and salt, crucial commodities, as Europe tried to rebuild itself. In a Europe where half the workforce had vanished, the Hanseatic League grew rich, supplying what survivors no longer had the ability to produce. And dotted around Europe were winners of a different kind institutions that did not die, even when the people inside them did. Churches and monasteries. The church became one of the largest landowners in Europe after the plague, not because they bought land, but because so much of it fell into their hands. When entire families died without heirs, when aging nobles bequeathed estates in exchange for spiritual salvation, the church absorbed territory like a sponge. The Cistercians in France and the Benedictines in Germany expanded their holdings dramatically. In an age of mass death, selling salvation turned out to be excellent business. And then there were the winners nobody ever calls winners because their rise wasn't dramatic, but steady. The laborers, the peasants, the survivors. For the first time in centuries, the bargaining power of ordinary people skyrocketed. The scarcity of labor meant wages increased across Europe. Serfs negotiated better terms, or walked away from feudal obligations entirely. Laws had to be passed to prevent runaway wage inflation. England's Statute of Labourers in 1351 is a perfect example of the elite trying to legislate their way out of supply and demand. But laws don't override incentives. Wages rose anyway. Social mobility increased. Guilds opened their doors to new members. Apprentices became masters far earlier than tradition would have allowed. This wasn't riches in the elite sense, but it was the closest medieval Europe had come to a working class boom. For a brief historical moment, ordinary people had leverage. It was a quiet revolution born from demographic collapse. Still, if you want to understand the deepest economic lesson of the Black Death, you have to look beyond medieval Europe, because what happened in the 14th century isn't unique. It's the blueprint of crisis economics. Wealth doesn't disappear in catastrophes, it changes hands. This pattern repeats in every major collapse. During the 2008 financial crisis, distressed debt investors and private equity firms emerged stronger than ever. During the COVID-19 pandemic, billionaire wealth surged by trillions while small businesses closed permanently. The tools changed structured finance instead of inheritance law, online monopolies instead of grain cartels, but the mechanism is identical. That's why studying the plague's winners isn't just historical curiosity. It's a reminder that crises are not equalizers. They are accelerators. They amplify existing advantages. They reward those with liquidity, connections, and adaptability. And they create opportunities for those positioned to act while everyone else is struggling to survive. The Black Death didn't simply kill half of Europe. It reshuffled the deck of European wealth and power. It set the stage for the Renaissance by empowering families like the Medici. It altered the political structure of England. It strengthened the Hanseatic League. It expanded the economic footprint of the church. There is a quiet irony in this. The plague that seemed to end the world ended up creating the world that followed. Out of devastation came mobility, consolidation, and new elites. Out of loss came opportunity. The lesson isn't comforting, but it is clarifying. Disasters don't distribute wealth evenly. They create pockets of immense opportunity, and whether that opportunity becomes progress or exploitation depends entirely on who steps forward. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand how wealth behaves in crises, you'll never understand how power is built. If what I shared today helped you see the world from a different perspective, don't forget to subscribe, because history always has an answer. You just need to look from the right angle.